Hey there. So in this second lecture series, actually I'm not sure if it's going to be one or two videos this time. Hopefully not. Hopefully not three. Uh, this week, what I want to do is just briefly rehearse what we went over in class before we turned to our discussion of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, a book that, as I told the class on Tuesday, I spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about. A book that keeps me up at night. A book, one of the many books to which I've decided to dedicate my life in terms of reading, studying, and teaching others how to read. But before I get to Mrs. Dalloway, I just wanted to very quickly rehearse for us the quote unquote method that of new criticism that I covered last week, and which I hope you've studied on your own, that you've read and taken notes on from the Parker book, and that you may have even taken notes on by watching last week's lecture series too. So, so I just want to review the sort of four-step new critical method that we draw from Parker's book. Parker, the author of our main textbook, How to Interpret Literature. So, step one, isolate the text. Step two, notice a problem. I spent quite a bit of time trying to explain what sort of problem in the last lecture series, but two, notice a problem. Step three, track this problem as it recurs, maybe in various forms across the text. And step four, what I'm now calling jazz hands. In other words, the sort of sudden demonstration that the repetition of this problem, of this evidence of disunity, is actually the key to understanding the way in which the text, because, well, if it is great literature, manages to harmonize and balance apparent disunities into some kind of harmony or some kind of unity. I have our dear friend Cleanth Brooks with me here, and just to read a little bit of it for us, read a little bit of Brooks for us. This is from page 195 of the you don't have the book maybe, but page 195 of my copy of the Well-Wrought Urn. Brooks has just stated that maybe what his version or his ideal version of interpreting literature should entail is the discovery, understanding, and demonstration of how the structure of a literary text works, or for him, how the structure of a particular poem might work. The important question to ask is, what do you mean by structure? Right? What do you mean by structure? Or what do you mean by form, if instead of structure we're using the word form? Brooks writes, "The structure meant is a structure of meanings, evaluations, and interpretations, and the principle of unity which informs it seems to be one of balancing and harmonizing connotations rather than denotations, attitudes, and meanings," meaning that there are competing attitudes within a single poem, and certainly within our novel, Mrs. Dalloway. But even here, one needs to make important qualifications. The principle is not one which involves the arrangement of various elements into homogeneous groupings, pairing like with like. It unites, in other words, the like with the unlike, right, into a harmony, into a balance. Remember his thesis that the language of poetry, or the language of literature, is a language of paradox, right? The balancing or the harmonization of like with unlike, by way of a kind of metaphorical, not a kind of, but by way of metaphor and analogy, and figurative language. It does not unite them, however, he continues, by the simple process of allowing one connotation to cancel out another one, nor does it reduce the contradictory attitudes in each poem to harmony by a process of subtraction. It's not as if the competing attitudes or contradictions or elements of a paradox within a literary text constitute a battle that has one victor, right? So that you have a sort of winning and losing attitude in the literary text, but rather they work together in some sense, competing and collaborating. The unity is not a unity of the sort to be achieved by the reduction and simplification appropriate to an algebraic formula. It is a positive unity, not a negative. It represents not a residue, but an achieved harmony. In other words, great literature for Brooks is the kind of literature that doesn't just directly state some kind of moral or communicate some kind of message, but is the working out and the balancing of paradoxical ideas that enable the poem to, let's say, express a more complicated idea in the only way that poetry can. Or, generalizing Brooks's point, the only way that literature can, which is by grouping together and bringing about a unity among discrepant and disparate elements, even contradictory and conflicting ones. Okay. So this is what I mean by jazz hands, that the fourth step of the new critical method, that at some point the critic needs to move from simply tracking a kind of discontinuity across a literary text and show that it is actually key to bringing about a kind of harmonious unity, a kind of significant, let's say, balance among elements that otherwise would be at odds with each other. Okay. Last week, we looked at the poem, Wilfred Owen's poem Dulce et Decorum Est, tried to show the way in which the odd description of ecstasy within a battle scene, while initially out of place in a poem like that, actually helped the poem express an attitude, a complex of attitudes toward war, especially toward the condition of the soldiers that experience war and experience life after battles, that is really, really about a kind of an odd perpetual oscillation between trances and what was the other thing? Trances and excitations, maybe, sort of manic states of fumbling, as it were, for gas masks. But anyway, some sort of oscillation between those states, and that the poem's word ecstasy is this perfect encapsulation of both of those all at once. Okay, so that was what I tried to show last week. Okay, so this week we're talking about a much larger text, right? That's a 28-line poem, I think, and this is a 200-page novel. By no means the longest novel in the world, but still much longer than a double sonnet. So how would we go about doing something like that? Okay. How would we go about pursuing a new critical reading of a novel like Mrs. Dalloway? Well, the first thing is we have to isolate the text. But what does that mean, right? This is an important step because implicit in that step is the idea that the new critic actually knows a great deal about the author's life, knows a great deal maybe even about what the author has to say about his or her own works of literature, or maybe just literature in general. That the literary critic does know a great deal about history and a great deal about the development of literary history. And so the first step only makes sense, isolate the text, if the critic bracket that out, if the critic already knows a great deal. Okay. So with that in mind, maybe oddly, the first step is actually to learn a little bit about what Virginia Woolf herself has to say about literature and about Mrs. Dalloway in particular. If you go onto Sakai, you'll find a handout of quotes a handout that includes quotes from an introduction that Woolf wrote to her novel 3 years after its publication, an introduction for an American edition of the novel. It's a very short introduction. She really doesn't say very much about Mrs. Dalloway, but she says some pretty nevertheless, some little what she calls odds and ends that are pretty interesting. I've also included some passages from her diary, her diary when she was working on Mrs. Dalloway that is actually also pretty fascinating, and also a passage from her very important essay Modern Fiction, which appeared in a collection of essays called The Common Reader, which, as it turns out, was published the exact same year as Mrs. Dalloway. And so Mrs. Dalloway is interesting to us if we're interested in Woolf's biography, partly because at the same time that she's working on Mrs. Dalloway, she's working on a book of essays about literature at the same time. So she's already thinking at a kind of meta level about how literature works, how she wants her own literature to work, and and um, and actually about all the literature of the past in her own tradition as an English writer that she admires. Right. So, anyway, I just want to read one of the quotes from this handout, and it's the bottom one. Okay, the bottom one taken from her essay Modern Fiction. Okay. She says, she writes, examine for a moment an ordinary mind on an ordinary day. The mind receives a myriad impressions, trivial, fantastic, evanescent, or engraved with the sharpness of steel. From all sides they come, an incessant shower of innumerable atoms. And as they fall, as they shape themselves into the life of Monday or Tuesday, the accent falls differently from of old. The moment of importance came not here, but there. Let us record the atoms as they fall upon the mind, as they fall upon the mind, in the order in which they fall. Let us trace the pattern, however disconnected and incoherent in appearance, which each sight or incident scores upon the consciousness. Let us not take it for granted that life exists more fully in what is commonly thought big than in what is commonly thought small. Nothing, no method, no experiment, even of the wildest, is forbidden, or should be forbidden. Everything is the proper stuff of fiction. Every feeling, every thought, every quality of brain and spirit is drawn upon. No perception comes amiss. End quote. That's the end of that quote. It is incredibly tempting, a new critic would point out, to make Woolf's description of what fiction can be the sort of standard or the ground or the primary evidence for how we perceive Mrs. Dalloway itself to be operating. It's incredibly tempting, after all, to look at those pages in which Woolf seems to be recording thoughts, right, the atoms as they fall upon the minds of Septimus Smith, of Clarissa Dalloway, of Peter Walsh. But the new critic would ask us to hold on a minute and isolate the text from what Woolf has to say, or at the very least, use what Woolf has to say not as evidence, not as the key to how the text means and how the text brings about a harmony among discrepant elements, but instead maybe just a kind of supplement or a kind of aid to our own understanding of what is, in fact, a very complicated novel, and not to reduce what it might mean to what Woolf says. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So it's important to note, again, and I'm saying this, I think I've said this in the last lecture series, new critics of the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and even those who even literature professors who still prefer new criticism as a mode of doing their scholarship or even of teaching literature, that they often get a bad rap because people sort of stupidly claim that they think history doesn't matter or biography doesn't matter. Again, maybe some of them do, but Cleanth Brooks certainly didn't think that. Wimsatt and Beardsley, the authors of two very important essays, The Intentional Fallacy and the Affective Fallacy, certainly didn't think that either. But rather, what they thought, if I can attribute to Brooks the arguments of Wimsatt and Beardsley, is that we don't necessarily have access to the full complexity of what an author meant in a work of literature. That authors' intentions change. And that we shouldn't conflate the standard of our own readings with the cause of the novel itself, or the poem itself. That a text like Mrs. Dalloway is not just a sort of static outcome of an intention, but is a dynamic machine that is constantly working as we read it. It is, as Wimsett and Beardsley write, a feat of style. And literary criticism is not about trying to match up that feat of style with the expression of intent by an author, but rather to inhabit and sit with and track that feat of style and to show how it works. And if it lines up with what an author says, all the better. But if not, they aren't necessarily going to lose sleep over it. We might also point out that although what Woolf says is incredibly beautiful and theoretically robust, but it doesn't necessarily tell us a great deal about how to interpret Mrs. Dalloway. It might help us make sense of how to read it, but it doesn't tell us how to arrange or extract or to produce an interpretation of the novel's many competing attitudes and meanings. Okay, so that's another thing we might say about it. All right, so I'm going to pause there. We're just sort of completing the first step of our new critical reading, attempting to isolate Mrs. Dalloway away from what we might think is Woolf's stated intentions about how she approaches fiction. So we've tried to isolate that away, again, not because it doesn't matter, but because it doesn't necessarily prove one particular interpretation of how the novel balances its competing attitudes and meanings. So in the next video, I think it'll be the only other video, I'll try to work through steps 2 through 4 and perform or model for you a way in which we might pursue a new critical reading of a 200-page novel. Okay? All right.